Panel is about to start. So it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our second panel on domestic impacts. And Keith Banting is a professor emeritus at Queen's University. He's the author of numerous books on social policy and immigration. He is one of Hugh Segal's oldest friends and is the founder of the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University, which was so wise as to hire both Hugh and himself at the same time. We were like dueling banjos at Queen's from a liberal and a conservative perspective. So I'm delighted to turn the next session over to Keith Banting.
Thank you, Tom. One of the wisest things I did as director of the school was to hire Tom and Hugh to teach in the school, to run seminars. And the two of them, their student evaluations were through the roof, as you would expect. And they were always sort of neck and neck as to who delivered the most effective seminar. Now, it wasn't above Hugh Segal. Order in Chinese food for lunch for the entire class just before the evaluation forms were circulated. But I don't think it made a difference, and I've always remained mute as to precisely who won the horse race. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you to Tina. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. I share with what I assume to be everyone in this room, the most important characteristic, my most important characteristic for being here is that I enjoyed the magnificent gift of friendship with Hugh Segal. It was one of the most important relationships of my adult life, and like all of you, I will miss him dearly. But this is not about me to paraphrase our previous speaker, Mr. Shurey. It's not about me, it's about the two people I will introduce who are going to discuss Hugh's contributions over the domestic policy agenda. One of the really striking things about Hugh is that he was a true public intellectual whose ideas span such an immense array of policy issues, both on the domestic front and, as we'll track through this afternoon, on the international and defense side. So to some depth to our understanding of Hugh's issues, debates, and contributions, we have two people who knew Hugh well, were close to Hugh, and who are well placed to investigate, interrogate, and discuss the issues that he raised. Our first speaker will be Carolyn Tuohy, who is a long-time member of the faculty here at the University of Toronto and is one of our most highly regarded scholars on comparative public policy, with particular interest in social policy and especially with health policy. She is the author of some of the most important books on Canadian health policy, but also comparative health policies, to understand from the experience of other countries ideas that we might learn from and adapt or adjust or help find our way through the complications of health policy in this country. She is currently writing a book on the power of discourse in public policy, the power of the ideas and the language we use to discuss issues. Because the reality is that if you can get people to use your language, your way of thinking about a policy issue, you're halfway to getting them to adopt your policy response. And so Carolyn has always been someone who digs in at central issues in understanding, and particularly relevant because Hugh's contributions were at the level of discourse. You know, he was not a minister at any point. His ideas, his articulation were what mattered in his contribution to public policy. Carolyn also has had a distinguished contribution to the governance of this institution, to the University of Toronto. She served as provost and vice president for government and institutional relations, and her contributions have been memorialized, I guess is the right word, in the Carolyn Tuohy Impact on Public Policy Award, which has been created and is awarded annually to someone who has made a major contribution to public policy in this country. She is also senior fellow at college, which is also very fitting. Our second speaker is another long-term friend of Hugh Segal, that's Bill Fox, and someone I also like to call as well a friend. Bill's career comes through the complex interactions of the press, media, politics, and public policy, and he has practiced all sides of that politically sensitive and politically important process. He is an author who has investigated the role of the media and social media in political life. He's the author of Trump, Trudeau, Tweets, and Truth. T's possible, Bill. And his previous work was called Spin Wars and the New Media, which was a highly insightful analysis of the issues involved in the role of spinning politics and spinning presentations as a core feature of governance in the period. But Bill has not only just been a student of these processes, he's also been a practitioner of the dark arts. He's been a public affairs consultant. He was a journalist. He started his life as an important journalist. He was Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star. He participated in many of the public affairs commentaries. He served as press secretary and director of communications for the Prime Minister of Canada. He then, after a very distinguished career, chose to do something that most people who are academics advised him not to do. I was one of those who said, don't do it. He, after a successful career in the media world, he decided to go to university and do a doctorate. So he plowed through, and I watched the angst on his face at times as he plowed through some of the theoretical texts required of someone seeking that transition, but he successfully became Dr. Fox. And he has been actively involved in the intellectual and academic worlds, senior fellow at Massey. He has also been a fellow of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Public Policy, and Politics at Harvard, as well as a senior fellow for the Freedom Forum Media Studies Center, that's a mouthful, Columbia. Bill Fox is also a member of the Order of Canada, and most importantly, again, he's also a long-term friend of Hugh Segal. So we have two excellent speakers for today. I have asked each of them to keep their opening comments to about 20 minutes so that we'll have time for discussion afterwards, and I'll promise to do my very best to keep them to it. Thank you. Carolyn. Carolyn's going to go first.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that very generous introduction. And can I have a copy? I really. And thank you to Tom and to Nathalie for the invitation to speak to Hugh's contribution to social policy today. It is an enormous honor, a bittersweet privilege to do so. We intersected so much along the way on these issues. As I've said a couple times this morning, I only wish we were doing this as a Festschrift, but I am so honored, as I say, to be here. And you will notice some continuity in my remarks with those of Premier Charest. I was worried for a time a little too much continuity, since I will also be tracing Hugh's thought about conservatisms and Canadian conservatism in particular throughout his work, but I will be giving it a particular social policy slant. So let me begin by saying that Hugh Segal was a Canadian hero. And by that, I don't simply mean he was an admirable person. He most assuredly was. I don't mean to imply that he had no faults. I'm sure, like most of us, he had his share, but I'm hard-pressed to think of one. But I mean that he was a hero in the classical sense. He made an early choice of mission. He persisted in that mission, and he was loyal to his comrades along the way. The early choice was to become a Canadian conservative, inspired, he tells us, by John Diefenbaker at the age of 12. He also says that was, well, he doesn't put it this way, but his description lets us know that it was a choice that took some imagination and commitment in the context of his liberal-leaning family at the time. The mission was the pursuit of a distinctively Canadian conservatism, born of the accommodation of difference and the desire for peace and order, shaped by the Canadian experience. And his loyalty was to his fellow conservatives, but most of all, to Canada. Hugh's contribution to social policy in Canada stemmed from his passionate conviction that social justice is integral to conservative values, and especially to Canadian conservatism. Here is how he put it in his book, The Right Balance, of which we heard more this morning. Hugh had a way with book titles, I think. He said, conservative policy in Canada, because of our complex geographical, demographic, linguistic, and geopolitical realities, can only be simple and unidimensional for those who prefer simplicity to reality. The reality is that our conservatism stands alone in its unique mix of accommodation and social justice, which underlies the rock-ribbed Tory belief in tradition, institutional strength, and the balance between freedom and order. This deep belief that social justice was of a piece with conservative values, and indeed was a necessary requisite if conservative values were to be realized, was a constant through line in his thought. It was inspired by his own conservative heroes and eloquently expressed in his published work. Here's how he put it in his book, Beyond Greed, in 1997. Conservatism, he said, holds that society is an organic whole with its aggregate strengths and weaknesses linked to the strongest and weakest within society. The conservative view sees that it is no threat to freedom to attack the unfairness of a permanent underclass. The humanity that is expressed on behalf of society is the best bulwark against the instability of an entrenched and hopeless underclass who have little to gain from an orderly and civil society. Social justice cannot be a sometime product of free enterprises upcycles. Its role is as the fundamental linkage between the force of capitalist initiative and the benefits to all of social stability and individual opportunity. That, in a nutshell, is Hugh's crystalline belief in the integrity of social justice and conservative values, other conservative values. Of the conservative leaders who inspired and reinforced him in these ideals, Bob Stanfield and Bill Davis stood above all. Apologies to other conservative leaders. He dedicated Beyond Greed to Stanfield, from whom he learned the fundamental conservative truth that there is no contradiction between the values of compassion, freedom, social responsibility, frugality, and enterprise, and that to suggest otherwise was to diminish the very utility of modern conservatism to the public at large. Bill Davis got the dedication Balance in 2011 with the tribute that he, quote, reflected the essential balance, decency, compassion, and courage that anchored and still reflects what modern conservatism is at its inclusive and humane best. Hugh's commitment to social justice as of a piece with conservative values was made manifest in his career-long quest to enshrine a guaranteed income in Canadian social policy, a basic minimum to which all would be entitled by virtue of their membership in the community. It was a quest that began in the Stanfield days, if not earlier. Hugh describes Stanfield's linkage of conservative values and the concept of the guaranteed income in a passage describing Stanfield's elevated informal status after his resignation as conservative leader in 1976. Hugh says, Stanfield then moved into a kind of sainthood status in official Ottawa, a good measure of which was earned by humanity and genuine concern for the disadvantaged. He believed conservatives had a primary responsibility to address that concern if the right to excel, earn profits, and benefit from them was not to be perceived as being won at the expense of those less able to participate in the economy. His interest in the guaranteed annual income and his for progressive social measures were tied to that fundamental concern. The same exact words could be said about Hugh. He was greatly proud of the establishment of the guaranteed annual income supplement for seniors, adopted by the Davis government in 1975 during Hugh's time with Davis, while the federal GIS was still being treated as a temporary measure. Hugh was later to describe this policy achievement as, quote, a turning point of deep and everlasting impact on his, quote, lifelong engagement on the road to a better approach to poverty. Hugh also linked the basic income concept to other areas of social policy, notably healthcare. Under his leadership as president of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, the Institute established a task force on Canadian healthcare, on which I was privileged to serve. In 1999 and to 2000, which was a time of unusual ferment in Canadian ideas about healthcare. Although Hugh embraced the report's analyses of costs, comprehensiveness, accountability, and institutional structure, he took the occasion to turn the issue to the issue of poverty. Here's how he put it in his book, Bootstraps Need Boots, in 19, another great title. The excellent conclusions of the task force on healthcare regarding costs, comprehensiveness, etc., convinced me that extending the time frame for people to live independently without the need for acute healthcare treatment was the best cost and logistics management strategy. Where he's going with this. Since poor people need more acute healthcare overall and suffer more chronic diseases sooner than their better off counterparts, reducing poverty was obviously the best healthcare policy choice that any rational government might pursue. Leaving millions of Canadians behind the poverty line would diminish any all other successes. Any discussion of health policy and reinvestment without addressing the social determinants of health is simply irrelevant. So leave it to Hugh to bring it all back to poverty and guaranteed income. Finally, in the spring of 2016, Hugh was given the opportunity to shape a basic income strategy for Ontario, when the Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne commissioned him to produce a report to inform a basic income pilot project. That initiative would join a set of pilots being conducted in several jurisdictions around the world, including the Netherlands, Finland, and California, on different models. Hugh conducted that assignment with characteristic passion, rigor, and openness. I was privileged to work with him and Danielle Martin, a leading healthcare advocate among her many other talents, in convening a day-long roundtable of experts from the academy and the field in the council chamber of the University of Toronto. Those rich deliberations helped to inform his report, for which he further drew on a broad range of evidence with the assistance of one of Massey's brilliant junior fellows, Marie-Pierre Isabelle. The report, submitted in August 2016, quickly led to the launch of a basic pilot, testing 3 different designs in 3 different Ontario communities. Data collection was underway when, at the end of July 2018, the pilots were canceled by the new Conservative government that replaced Wynn's Liberals a third of the way through its trial run. It was the loss of an invaluable opportunity for data collection and a bitter disappointment for Hugh, who made no bones about expressing that in his book, Bootstraps Need Boots. I myself have reservations about universal basic income as an instrument of public policy, although I was and am in total accord with the values of simplicity, inclusion, and community, which motivated Hugh's commitment to it. My views are closer to those of UBC economist David Green and his colleagues in their critique of the concept for the Institute for Research on Public Policy. They argue that the apparent simplicity of the basic income framework would dissolve once it is scaled from the pilot phase to the population at large, where problems of ensuring take-up and integration with existing targeted programs of assistance would add to the complexity of the social policy landscape. This critique is given some credence by the fact that none of the international pilots has resulted in a permanent scaled-up program, although there are a number of programs targeted at particular population segments that fly under the UBI banner. But we don't, in fact, have the hard evidentiary data that we need to show whether either Hugh, on the one hand, or David Green and I, on the other hand, are right about the feasibility and the effects of a guaranteed income model. The well-designed Ontario pilot would have gone some distance to filling that evidence gap, and its cancellation deprived us of that knowledge. That was a huge disappointment, even to those of us with reservations about the concept. I firmly shared with Hugh the belief that public policy needs to be evidence-based. I also believe that the idea of the basic income needs to be kept alive as a benchmark of ambition against which other proposals for a just social support need to be tested. And there was no better proponent for keeping it alive than Hugh Segal. David Green and his colleagues themselves illustrate this point. The last chapter in their report is titled, "If Not a Basic Income, What?" That's the test we need. Hugh's report on basic income speaks not only to his impact on the substance of social policy, but also to his role in the political process itself. The fact that it was commissioned and readily accepted by a Liberal government is shining testimony to Hugh's ability to work across political divides. Hugh was no Liberal, large L. He once described the party as supine intellectually to the use of government as a tool for social engineering and intervention in provincial jurisdiction, and elsewhere as being committed to a Canada by centralized design. He was fiercely loyal to his own party, even when it disappointed him. but his fundamental decency, humor, and commitment to good fellowship smoothed the flow of political discourse and lubricated the discussion of policy wherever he went. I will say publicly now and add to the accolades that Mr. Charest laid out for us what I said privately to friends and colleagues in the shared sorrow of his passing. Hugh was a precious ambassador for community and comity in Canadian public life. His passing leaves us poorer by his absence, richer for his legacy. Let it be an inspiration. Thank you.
Good morning to Principal Desrosiers, distinguished guests, friends of Hugh. It's an absolute honor to be here to pay tribute to a person that was a truly great business partner and an even better friend. Some years ago, during an extended academic walkabout, facilitated in no small measure by our host, Dr. Axworthy, I had the good fortune on numerous occasions to meet the media theorist Neil Postman. His most studied work, Amusing Ourselves to Death, considered the impact of a particular technology, television, on political discourse. Postman had a sight gag he used to illustrate his view of technology. At a certain point, he would hold up a Pilot flatliner pen like this one. And he would bemusedly declare that the pen was the only technology he needed to do his work. The gesture always made me think of Hugh Segal. Although in Hugh's case, the technology of choice was a fountain pen, like this one, as a companion piece to yellow foolscap paper. Postman was preoccupied with the consequences of political or public policy exchanges couched in television's language of entertainment, stripped of context or of meaning, a language that favored the interesting over the important. Ignorance is always correctable, but what do we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? Postman wondered. Daniel Burstein had earlier argued there is a risk to society if the shared concept of reality is an artifice. Hugh Segal's singular contribution to public discourse in Canada is, in many ways, a substantive response to Postman's question. Theorist Peter Drucker insisted a knowledge society demands for the first time in history that people with knowledge take responsibility for making themselves understood by people who do not have the same knowledge base. A responsibility Hugh Segal took on willingly and enthusiastically. Hugh may have been born with an inherent understanding of the power of communication. A self-described child of CBC, as a 12-year-old, he put pen to paper to write then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker to assure the chief he could count on Hugh's unwavering support in an upcoming federal election. As an undergraduate at the University of Ottawa, Hugh cold called a young Conservative MP, and David MacDonald, he and his party's agenda could be advanced meaningfully with speeches penned by Segal free of charge. Fresh off what would be his only electoral victory to the Student Council at the University of Ottawa, Hugh was picked to be the party's proverbial sacrifice as the PC candidate in the 1972 federal election in the safe Liberal seat of Ottawa Centre. If Hugh got the script, he didn't read it very carefully. He damn near won the seat. And that was the election that reduced the Trudeau government to a minority, dependent on the support of New Democratic Party MPs for confidence votes in the House. Some things in Canadian politics don't change. The seat count settled at 109 Liberals, 107 Progressive Conservatives. Think how history might have read differently had Hugh prevailed. As his several careers unfolded, Hugh was widely acknowledged to be an exceptionally skilled communicator. He was, as you all know, as quick with a quip as anyone you will ever meet. He could summarize a situation in a single sentence. One of my favorites, quote, "In politics, you dig your grave with small shovels." His reference to Senate appointments as, quote, "a taskless thanks," was another one of my favorites. Yet Hugh also understood that in public discourse, simple, declarative sentences had to be rooted in substantive ideas. Je pense, j'y suis does not take a lot of time to articulate. Hugh had the curiosity of a journalist and the discipline of inquiry of a scholar. He was available if a reporter needed a quote and could provide good clip to broadcast journalists dans les deux langues officielles du Canada. He'd reach for a fountain pen if you needed an op-ed page piece and could write or deliver in Churchill cadence a keynote address at a conference with equal ease. Hugh, along with former Liberal Senator Michael Kirby and NDP strategist Jerry Kaplan, made Canada AM's political panel must-see TV every Thursday morning. And in sharp contrast to and this is not very generous on my part, the partisan parrots that populate too many of today's panels, regurgitating the same three talking points ad nauseum, Hugh, Michael, and Jerry brought quick wits, quicker minds, and the courage of their convictions to an informed and informing discussion of the issues of the day. Hugh's books can fill a shelf in a good-sized bookcase. His starting premise in any policy or political discussion was that there was a role for government in our lives. In his words, to provide the infrastructure that ensures genuine opportunity of outcomes. I often would think of Hugh phenomenon across the country, but here in Toronto, you often find yourself walking down the street and walking past a homeless person. And in a time when jobs are going unfilled, the less generous among us might have a tendency to say, why don't you get a job? Why don't you get going? Hugh Segal would walk by that same person and he would think, what do we, as a community, have to put in place to help that person get where they want for their best outcome? And that's a fundamental difference. The breadth and depth of Hugh's interest is as a champion of basic annual income, as well as his role as chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Policy and International Trade. He helped appreciate how Canadian conservatism was different from conservatism in the UK or the US, acknowledging that those differences are becoming less apparent some days. Oft-repeated description of Hugh as the happy warrior is most appropriate, although his infectious good humor could cause some people to forget the warrior part. And Hugh was a warrior. He understood you had to fight for the change you wanted. For Hugh, a disagreement, whether he was, quote, neoconservative excess or making the point you can't actually pull yourself up from the bootstraps if you have no boots, was where conversations started, not where they ended. He believed in evidence-based decision-making. He was genuinely angry with the Ford government for canceling the pilot project. And the reasoning on Hugh's part was very straightforward. That trial would have provided the evidence that in turn would have been the basis for a spirited but better informed public policy debate. Hughes was a life of purpose and principle. As an advisor to a premier and a prime minister, he was a direct participant in the defining public policy issues of his time, the patriation of the Constitution, NAFTA, acid rain treaties, and as Canada's special emissary to the Commonwealth, he worked to redefine the institution's role of the world. Like a conservative, Hugh was a great believer in institutions, but he also believed in the need for institutions to evolve, to improve, to change, to adapt. It's no wonder that as president and CEO of the IRPP, two of the research initiatives that he led, The Art of the State, Strengthening Canadian Democracy. Now, Hugh had a special relationship with media. And as you all know, the source relationship is at the center of much of our political journalism. When you think about it, journalists don't go to cabinet. They don't get to sit in caucus. They're not invited to the National Campaign Committee meeting. They don't get to wander around the halls of the Prime Minister's office. So they are dependent on the source relationship. And we have all read stories that contain the facts attributed to, quote, sources close to. Close to can be an exceedingly objective description. But in those instances where Hugh was the source, he certainly qualified as close to. Hugh believed in the rule of law and defended that principle, whether the specifics were the invocation of the War Measures Act in 1970 or the treatment of 3 of his Senate colleagues by the government of the day. The communications theorist Isabel Newman wrote of it called a spiral of silence, where attempts to challenge a congenial truth are met with such hostility that the challengers of that conventional wisdom simply stop intervening. Martin Luther King perhaps put it best when he said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemy, but the silence of our friends." Nelson Mandela agreed. Fools multiply when the wise are silent. Hugh never stopped intervening, even when it would have been politically wiser to do so. In the Senate case, for example, Hugh stood alone, without a text, and admonished his colleagues for their defiance of fundamental principles of justice. We are in the process of, in my judgment, imposing a very arch, difficult, unfair judgment in a fashion that constitutes pretrial sentencing. That was Hugh Segal. The media theorist James Carey said society constructs reality through communication. Historically, legacy media were central to that process. The media were deemed important not because the media told us what to think, but more precisely because the media told us what to think about. In any liberal democracy, media is a primary site. The agenda-setting properties of legacy media have long been acknowledged, and Hugh was a multimedia maven. And while journalism provides much of the shorthand for political discourse, technologies have dramatically increased the number of sites where that conversation can occur. Clay Shirky encouraged us to think of media as an ecosystem. More roles, more voices, more paths, more opportunities. Three of four of the world's peoples have a mobile phone. And as a consequence, Facebook is basically a utility, essential to disseminating information. Postman said every technology is both a burden and a blessing, not either or, but this and that. And Marshall McLuhan advised us that, quote, any new means of moving information will alter any power structure. McLuhan, of course, was building on Innes, that any change in the means of communication entails a change in the very makeup of civilization. And the internet, specifically social media, have most emphatically altered our power structures, what Richard Lamb describes as the economy of attention now prevails. There is still a lot of good journalism today, maybe even better journalism than there ever was, but it can be hard to find, submerged as it is in the trivial and the inconsequential. V.O. Key reminded us that the output of any echo chamber bears an inevitable and invariable relation to the input. And the input for social media has a distinct look and feel to it. As Andrew McDougall, Communications Director to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, said, "What sells online is salacious fiction, delivered with a side of snark. The new laws of digital politics are disgraceful, but they're effective." Journalist Justin Lang observed, "We started giving people angry content, and they got angry in response." Lest anyone think even our most distinguished journalistic enterprises are free of these pressures, consider this headline in a piece carried by the Press Gazette, and I quote, "How a robot named Sophie helped Canada's Globe and Mail hit 170,000 digital subscribers." Now, Hugh, to understate the case, was technologically challenged. He may have been the last person on the planet still using a BlackBerry. And his call for civility in public discourse is more difficult to heed in an online world where algorithms reward aggressive speech. Now, information and disinformation predate the internet, to be sure. The New York Post in 1824 carried a front-page story about how somebody was going to get across the Atlantic Ocean in a balloon in 3 days. Story written by somebody named Edgar Allan Poe, who went on to find employment elsewhere. But social media platforms do allow us to construct our own reality, making agenda setting and consensus building even more difficult. Hugh and I spent a lot of time in recent years talking through where journalism has to go. We shared a view that wedge politics produce wedge policy. The healthcare system may be struggling and threatened in budgetary terms, but my license plate is free. I guess that makes sense to somebody. That the business model for legacy media has collapsed is no surprise. Marshall McLuhan spelled out the how and the why 60 years ago. And the media probably should have paid more attention to Kathleen Hall Jamieson's 1988 warning that political journalists were busy fashioning the very coverage that would lead to their demise. Hugh and I reflected on Ken White's point that foreigners aren't supposed to own our own media, yet many of our largest newspapers have fallen into the hands of American bondholders. We talked about news deserts and about how the largest newspaper in our nation's capital doesn't actually have a newsroom, and that political leaders no longer rely on the legacy media to connect with voters. As Paul Wells put it in a recent Substack piece, Pierre Poilievre, who I have talked to for years, doesn't talk to me anymore because he doesn't have to. Groupthink, packed journalism, congenial truths, diminishing resources, these were all subjects that we like to talk about at some length. We were convinced that public discourse in Canada required a media for less stenography and more journalism. No more stories with leads that finished with the words, "said yesterday." A journalism as described by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Alex Jones, not radio Alex Jones, a journalism that accepted as its first obligation to the truth, its first loyalty to citizens, and its essence, the discipline of verification. Because we also shared Walter Lippmann's view that there can be no liberty for a community which lacks the information by which to detect lies. A couple of weeks ago, The Economist had a feature story that examined how artificial intelligence was going to impact the 2024 presidential election in the United States. And when I read it, I laughed and thought to myself, this would have kept Hughie going months. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Carolyn and Bill for thoughtful reflections linking Hugh and contemporary life. We have time, I'm not sure how much time I have, but let's just ignore the gentleman over there. And let's open it up for questions. Please use the mic because it's being live streamed. So there's, sorry, I don't know your name. Jason will bring you the mic. Who would like to start, please? No? Okay, we have. Okay.
My question is to Professor Tuohy. What do you imagine would be the next level of trials that we need to do for basic income? Is the idea that it should be tried in its different forms to really lead to the conclusion yay or nay? Or is it really that we need to examine new theories or new ideas about how to move the ensuring social justice or income security for our citizens?
Thank you for that, Nathalie. I think it's such an important question, which way we take this forward. What we seem to be observing is our various programs, or in some cases pilots, that are called basic income, but they're actually targeted to certain population groups. Could be pregnant women, it could be youth in crisis, there are a number of examples. And that may be indeed the way to go, the most politically feasible way to go. What it means is, at least for those target populations, you try to simplify things as much as possible, provide a basic platform with relatively few questions asked, relatively few eligibility requirements, relatively few requirements for jumping through hoops to access the benefit. The various things that basic income can do, but not universal, not for the population. And possibly continuing to test at those targeted levels will ultimately make it possible either to scale up to a true universal basic income, or at least to ensure that those targeted programs are better designed, simpler, easier to access across the world.
Okay, Mr. Charest next.
I have a question for Bill and Mrs. Tuohy. Bill, your remarks about the media and social media for anyone involved in public policy are extremely important, but a little urging. I'd like to hear you a little more about what is the answer for those of us who care about that. How do we push back against that? And Mrs. Tuohy, the question I have for you is, the COVID episode has brought forward a whole series of policy initiatives that are relevant to a universal basic income, both in the United States and Canada. And you may have seen in the States the withdrawal of the program has increased child poverty. What have we learned from what the Americans and Canadians have done? How does that inform future discussion on the universal basic income?
Bill, are you going to be?
Sure, yep.
Is there an optimistic?
Absolutely. You can't be at an event for Hugh Segal and not be Pollyannish about the opportunity in front of you. So part of my answer to your question is I'm going to quote a very wise person by the name of Jean Charest. When I made the point about Jim Carrey and his observation, communication is where society constructs reality. Part of the reality of the social media age is that it is easier for various communities to construct their own reality. right? So the Make America Great crowd, through social media, can convince themselves that they are possessors of the only and the absolute truth. Legendary Toronto Star editor Borden Spears told us many years ago, truth is cumulative. It's a work in progress. And the key to the optimism that you're looking for, Mr. A, is the point that you made in your speech. It's engagement. Huey would have been an enthusiastic supporter of the idea of engagement on every platform, at every level, with every community. You know, we made references to the fact that he was a person, but he could appreciate discussion and debate with others who might have another worldview. And to me, the biggest single risk of social media is that we're losing that connection. So the way to break through, as far as I'm concerned, is engagement on as many platforms, in as many places, in as many forums, and in as many forms as you can.
Okay, Carolyn.
On what we've learned from the pandemic and the responses to it, I think that there are some ways in which we have learned, other ways in which we missed opportunities to learn. We've learned something about the administration of benefits like CERB. We've learned that we can actually roll these things out relatively quickly and effectively. And we've learned to tolerate some of us have tolerated, others I guess have not, some roughage around in the administration of those programs. We've also, they may have had a kind of demonstration effect. I'm not really sure about this. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that they've had a demonstration effect in the public at large about the feasibility of such programs. But they were never designed they couldn't be in the period of time had to be developed. They were not designed to be learned from in a policy development sense. There was not the kind of data collection that the Ontario pilot, for example, or the pilots in other jurisdictions would have allowed for. So sadly, we don't actually know the effects of those programs on any sort of grand level that would allow us to pursue them as serious policy. So it's a half full and half empty response, but we've learned something about rolling such programs out that may have surprised some people about the capacity of the state. I suspect it did. But we don't know enough about the effects to design programs on a permanent, ongoing basis.
I think two. Can I slip one in at the end? Is Sherry? Sherry, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sherry, thank you both for your wonderful presentations. I was struck by the reference this morning to the fact that Hugh, and maybe it was you, Tom, Hugh said that being appointed to the Senate was a taskless thanks. And I wonder, it made me think, was it an incredible, brilliant quip, as it might have been, or did he really feel that way? Given his respect for Canadian institutions, I found it a bit of a surprise. And maybe, Bill, I don't know if this question is for you, but were there aspects of the Senate that he would have wanted to reform, or what were the problems that he saw that made it really difficult for him to be effective, or feel that it might have been a taskless thanks?
Well, the taskless thank one-liner was, Hugh as Catskill comedian. Because in fact, he lived quite the opposite. His Senate was one of commitment, was one of giving meaning to the Senate as its absolute constitutional declared purpose, which was a chamber of sober second thought. And he worked like a Trojan at the committee level, in terms of the debates in the Senate, in terms of taking the Senate message out across the country. To me, he was the personification of what the Senate was created to do. And he was the personification of what the originators of Confederation had in mind for that chamber. But like everybody else, he understood it had to evolve, and it had to have some changes, and it had to have some purpose, and people had to see the purpose. And part of what makes Hugh so exceptional is that every time you interacted with him, you came away with, apart from everything else, a sense of the purpose of the Senate.
Okay, Mr. Ethan? Sorry, if I got the right name, I think I'm right.
Thank you very much.
Senator, thank you.
I worked in the Senate with Hugh Segal on social justice issues. We produced a report in 2009 called In From the Mars, a call to action on poverty, housing, and homelessness. He convinced me, not long into that process, that basic income was indeed part of the solution, and I still say it is. You know, it's categorized as a universal system, but getting everybody involved with it is not what we saw, I don't what Hugh saw, as what was needed. What was needed basically is to take on the responsibility of doing something about poverty in this country. There are still millions of people in poverty. And, you know, there was a lot of notions about, oh, it'd be too expensive, it's too complicated. Well, we have a responsibility to do something about poverty. It's in the Declaration of Human Rights, it's in so many covenants that we signed with the United Nations. We have that right exists in this country. And we both understood that, you know, if you give people a lift up, if you give them the boot, they're going to pull themselves up. And that's one thing that even with these curtailed pilot projects, such as the one in Ontario and others, where you get a change of government and the new government comes in and cancels what the previous government was doing. But that's what the information, the anecdotal information, if not the full statistical information, was indicating. That a lot of people were using this money to really pull themselves up, to get this very indignified kind of existence on social welfare, or to get out of homelessness. So that's what we still need to keep our eye on, is to develop a system. And he was fiscally conservative on this, so he wasn't about to propose something that would cost an arm and a leg, but to make sure that we acquit ourselves of the responsibility of doing all we can to diminish, if not eliminate, poverty in this country.
I suspect that's for you, but maybe you could engage at the break.
I was taking it more as a comment.
Yeah, okay.
But let me just say, it is that articulation of the idea that I was emphasizing. It's important to be kept alive, even if it is not, even if the realization, the implementation difficulties derail particular initiatives. It is fundamentally important to keep that idea alive, to keep these various seeds or targeted programs I was talking about sprouting as a test against which other social policy proposals have to be tested. And I think, again, that was Hugh's huge contribution, and consistent from the late 70s all the way through his work. And as I said, even the critics, when they come to their conclusions, say, okay, now it's up to us. If we want to achieve these ideals, how do we propose to do it? But I do think in order to answer your question fully, we need more evidence. We need, just to repeat again, the kinds of evidence that the Ontario pilots would have produced. Yes, they were small scale, they were in 3 different communities, but they were really well designed to collect that information. And it would have been such fodder for the policy process and such ammunition in the political debate. It really is a tragedy that pilots were canceled. Tragedy kind of in the classical sense. I started talking about Hugh as being a hero. That was a tragic turn, I think.
Okay, I'm going to make what I hope is a simple question. We've described Hugh as a happy warrior, but sometimes happy warriors get down. They get depressed. After the cancellation, Hugh and I had a conversation in which he described himself and his life as a champion of failed causes. Okay? Now, this is one moment of Hugh, but when he went through the things he had championed, the electoral campaign he had led, the championship of basic income being the most recent one, a whole range of issues he tackled, he didn't see at times much progress, right? So, how would you briefly tell Hugh he's wrong and that he was actually a champion of real causes and a real agent of change? What would you say to him? Because he did have, from time to time, we all do, down times.
Well, I started by saying that he was a hero in the classical sense. And heroes don't necessarily succeed in classic epics, but they persist. They never give up. They're true to the mission. They're loyal to their colleagues and their comrades. And that's what he did. That was the example that he was. Whether he ultimately succeeded in the UBI, and who knows what lies in the future for the UBI. But that's what
That's what you would have said.
if I had the opportunity, what I would say to him, you're a hero.
Bill?
I would set it up with two factoids. The first being the technology for what we came to know in the 1980s as the fax was developed in 1847. Second factoid I'd share with him is that the technology and engineering that led to mobile phones was finalized the year I was born in 1947. In both cases, it took a while. And so what I would say to Hugh to encourage him is, that is the price of being a thought leader. That is the price of being ahead of the pack. That is the price that is inherent in trying to introduce change. You know, when Hugh and I were part of the public opinion research business, we used to laugh at each other and say, you know, when we got into it, we didn't understand that for a lot of people, the word change is actually a 4-letter word. And so I'd say that's just the price of being a leader. That's what it is.
Okay. Thank you to Ken and to Bill and to you for your questions. Pardon me?
So, ladies and gentlemen, lunch is next door in the upper library. It is just over here. Please have some lunch, enjoy each other's company, tell some anecdotes about Hugh, and then we'll come back for our second panel on the foreign, defense, and strategic implication of Hugh Segal's thought. Next door.